This is just a sidebar video on the timing of Hanukkah. The main place where you're going to find this is going to be in the Book of Maccabees, which is not Bible, but it does have some accurate historical data in it. That's one reason to look at it. So we're just going to briefly go through this. Kittim. That's the term that's used in Daniel 11. It refers to the area of Thrace, which is the northeastern highlands of Greece. And then if you were to go down the coast, picture in your mind what Greece looks like. You were to go down the coast, if you were going to go relatively straight down the coast, at as little angle as possible, you'd hit Crete. And then to the right of Crete, for, I don't know, it looks like 200-300 miles, you'd hit Cyprus. And then if you went like another 200 or 300 miles, you'd hit Israel. Okay, going west once you hit Crete. Not east once you hit Crete. So this is yet another entanglement of Greeks and the Jews that has really been going on since Solomon. And it's really kind of important to know, because that's why Daniel is written the way it is that there was a lot of what went wrong for Israel was that she was too enamored of Greek culture. That's always been her problem. And the people who are called the Philistines are really the original Palestinians. Okay? They're not Arabs. They're Greek sea peoples who came from this group of folks in Thrace. There were other Greek sea peoples also, Dorics, blah, blah. But these are the ones who ended up doing most of the traveling and staying. And so that's one of the reasons why they're mentioned. Now, Solomon had a real close relationship with a guy named Hiram, king of Tyre. He was originally, his people had come from this area. Okay. The Tyrians ended up, getting into this cult, which, Solomon himself even supported, of the god of Chemosh, or Chemosh, however you want to pronounce it. That was one of those gods where you had to burn your kids in the god's lap in order to get good crops. Really gross culture. But that culture spread across the northern coast of Africa and became known as Carthaginian. The Carthaginians were very good traders, as was Hiram. And what basically happened was the underbelly of Greece and Italy became very much a Carthaginian lake. All right, and eventually, when the Latins started fighting each other, the push of Persia, you have to think about this as a leftward moving population power problem. Persia kept pushing westward. That finally got to the Scythians and the Greeks, and that's what caused the big clash between the Persians and the Greeks, starting with Darius the Great. The Greeks, meanwhile, had always been, for at least 1,000 years, been, sea peoples and traders and all that good stuff. So they were already investing the southern areas of the Mediterranean, the northern coast of Africa. They were already doing that. And this just encouraged them to do it the more. Well, as they did it the more, that, thinking of dominoes moving westward, had an impact on the growing colonies of Latium, which originally were Etruscan, and there were other sea peoples, including the Greeks, who mixed with them, and there were other Latins, and that ended up coalescing in this really fetid marshland that became known as Rome, on the western side of Italy, about 2/3 down the coast, the westward coast. Well, the Carthaginians, who, like I said, from generations back, originally came from this kind of stock, had a long history of contact with Israel, friendly contact, basically. And they were, building Carthage, because there were more than one Carthage, on the North African coast, and their trading was so phenomenal, and they gained so much power and control of the seas and blah, 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 that started upsetting Rome. what became Rome. And that's where you've got the 3 Punic Wars, which is where Daniel basically closes Daniel 9, his prayer. He's closing it right at the beginning of the part of the Second Punic War, where Hannibal ends up, not Hannibal himself, but Hamilcar, ends up limping home, and Sardinia goes back into Roman hands. See, there was this big fight over who had control, and the Romans basically had the same kind of mindset that the Soviet Union does. They want to protect their border territory as a buffer state from incursions from the Greeks. And so that's why they ended up getting into the Punic Wars, okay, because the Carthaginians were pretty aggressive. And the Romans were a cruel people, but they weren't quite as cruel as the Carthaginians as far as religion goes. So, this was the issue that was going on. Now, Alexander, again, is one of them coming out of that same territory, and he was born about 345. He died in 312. And the Book of Maccabees is picking up on what Daniel predicted about, the belly of brass. I think belly of brass. That's Alexander, that's Greece. Okay, so it's covering to this part, and then this right here is 312 BC, right here at verse 7. All right? And then this is the war of the Diadochi, the 4 generals. All right? Now, when it says here, this is what I want to focus on so you can understand their timing. When it says 107th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, the Seleucid Empire, first of all, this is Antiochus. He's a Seleucid. Seleucus was one of the 4 generals when Alexander died. And he ended up taking the area that is basically Asia Minor, okay, closest to Greece. And he established his own little area there. And Ptolemy, his chief rival, because there were 2 other guys, but they didn't last long. Ptolemy, his chief rival, ended up establishing his own little kingdom in Egypt. And so the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were always fighting with each other. So in the 107th year of the kingdom of the Greeks, that means 312 BC minus 107. So that you know what you're looking at when you look at Maccabees. When it says here, after his conquest of Egypt in the year 143, that's measured on the same basis as this is measured. Okay, so it's the 143rd year after 312 BC when Alexander died. Okay, he tried to take, in his usual, the fighting with the Ptolemies. He tried to take them. He didn't succeed. This was due to Rome's intervention. This was that famous thing with the circle in the sand. He didn't do too well, just as Daniel predicted. He turns about in fury and he advances on Israel in massive strength. This is the beginning of the 2300 days in Daniel 8. I want to say it's Daniel 8, 13 or 14. Okay, this is what they're measuring. That's why that verse is there. Okay, I mean, just because it's not Bible doesn't mean it's wholly inaccurate. I mean, 2, 3, and 4 Maccabees are rather wacko. But one Maccabees has got some genuine history in it. Okay, so this is 170 BC, okay, when the 2300 days begins. Okay, you can maybe call it 169 again. There's a problem about, when years begin and when years end. So what we call, 160, 170, and what they call 170 are going to be different because the fiscal years are not the same. All right, so, but the point is, it's about that time. That's when the 2300 days gets measured. So that's what the guy is doing here. Whoever wrote Maccabees is measuring that time. All right, so he's going to 143, and then, which is our 170 or 169, and then 2 years after that, that's when the abomination occurs. So it's about 169 in our terms, okay, when this happens. Right here. And there could be a big lapse here too, because this thing lasted a while before Antiochus actually left. So in other words, he had a conquest of Egypt in 170, but then Rome got involved, and there was about a year and a half hiatus, okay, before he comes back. Okay, and he had plundered Egypt in his wake, and that's what he did to the temple in 143 from 312. And then 2 years later, that's when he does the abomination and stuff like that you can read about. Okay, and then, I hope I don't go too fast here. It should be 148. Let me just type it. Yeah, there we go. Then by the time you get to Maccabees 4:52, this is when Hanukkah occurs. Now, the first time they celebrated it, they rose at dawn. Okay, but they also ended up having a nighttime procession. That's where we get Feast of Lights from. Okay? And so that's the original Hanukkah verse right there. And Mary's going to be referencing, kicking off from that. But that's not the whole timeline she's using. I haven't quite worked that out. The next step on the thing is Maccabees 10. Right here, this is again 160 from 312. Right, that is the next time that Antiochus wanted to raise an army. All right, so that is 152 BC. Okay, so notice that 160 is 12 years after, because Mary's going to maybe reference this, is 12 years after the first Hanukkah, which is down here. Okay, that's 148. 12 years later is the next fight with Antiochus that occurs 12 years later. All right? Because Mary's going to start from the 1 Maccabees 4:52 verse. She's going to pick up here. And then it's a sort of straight chronology in here. Goes into kind of some detail. But I think it's in chapter 14. Let me go to it. Where you get to Demetrius. There's Demetrius. Okay, that's 7 years after, 8 years after the second battle with Antiochus. Demetrius was the local guy. Okay, that's another story within a story on the part of Ptolemy. And so how Demetrius took over. Demetrius wanted to fight with the Jews also, and this is recording that. Alright, there's a lot of treachery that goes on, blah, 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 blah. But what the author is tracing here is the rise of John Hyrcanus, which is really important. Right here. This is when John Hyrcanus comes to power. And that wait a minute. 312, which is their starting point in the measure, minus 170. 312 minus 170. 142 BC, which is 7 years earlier than we generally think of Hyrcanus coming to power. Okay, now maybe he wasn't officially a king or something, but this is his time. And then 171 a year later after that, so it's 141 when they won their independence. Alright, 141 BC. Because it's 312 minus 171, that tells you that's how to convert it to BC. Okay, and then from this time onward, John, who just came to manhood, that explains it. So John didn't actually take over until, according to history, 134 or so. And then this records what happens in 172, and it keeps on kind of going on from there. But it doesn't, see, we got 172 here, 18th of Elul. And this, this is where it starts getting really weird. I don't know if you can trust what's being said here, because it's all sort of self-aggrandizing. Alright. And it goes onward through Here's 174. Okay. So I'm trying to see if it stops. Thought it stopped at 178. So 174 we just saw. That's the third invasion of Antiochus. You know, and here are the exploits of John Hyrcanus. You know, Simon was the guy who usurped the priesthood and the kingship away from the house of Aaron and the house of Judah. And, you know, this is his reasoning why he did it. Okay, and Hyrcanus ended up being, you know, his son on the new fake throne. Okay. And this is where Israel really goes apostate. See, here's 172. That's kind of a backtrack from 174. And, you know, this is basically how they took power, how they usurped power away from the rightful houses that the Bible had set up, that God set up. So, you know, Israel was caught between a rock and a hard place. That's the story that's what makes Book of Maccabees relevant, is that on the one hand she was being attacked by Antiochus, and on the other hand, and you have to blame the houses in question for failing to rise up. On the other hand, she was defended not by her own, but by, you know, a guy from the house of Jehoram, which is the first priestly course in 1 Chronicles 24, and his kids. All right? So they're just taking over everything. And so here we got, this is 169, this was prior. All right, this is their citation of why they can say what they're doing. See? See, the Feast of Shelters is supposed to be occurring in the 7th month. They're moving it to the 9th month. This is total blatant abuse of Bible. They don't care about the Bible. All right? But if you have to choose between local bad rulers and foreign bad rulers, you're probably going to pick local bad rulers, and that's what happened. All right? And this is 188, which is 312 minus 188, 124. Okay? This is when John came to power. And this is him making changes. Okay? Just blatant. Doesn't matter what the law. They didn't care about the law. That's the point. They didn't care about the law. Israel went apostate from within. So this isn't going to last too long. This guy, John Hyrcanus, is the guy who he'll end up getting, you know, what do you want to call it, sort of close with the Nabatean Arabs. That's where Herod's family comes from. And they will end up basically, you know, marrying into and being traitors to the house of Hyrcanus. And that's how they end up getting involved with Rome. These guys started, under Hyrcanus, they started to really, you know, make nice with Rome, anybody, so that they could get off the Greeks. And the Romans and the Greeks had already had their little ultimatum back in 170 BC. 170, 169, even 168, depending on who you look at, you know, what calendar they're using. All right? So, and then they were also trying to play off the Ptolemies. All right? So all this is basically, you know, diplomatic letters going back and forth, blah, 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 blah. And the games that got played to keep Israel's independence. All right? See? That's 172. Where did I show it? 171 was when they got their independence. We just saw it earlier in the video. I'll have to go back and look. Because I'm just reading the text as I move. kind of hard to see it. Anyway, there we go. This is 172, but the year before, they won their independence from the Greeks. And now they engage in a bunch of diplomatic maneuvers. Okay? One of which is to get power over your own so that you can present a united front to the foreigners. You got Greece as a foreigner, you got Egypt as a foreigner, which is run by other Greeks, and then you got Rome as a foreigner. And since Rome didn't like, Rome was ostensibly a friend on the Ptolemy side because Seleucus was too close. Ptolemy was farther away, so you make friends with Ptolemy so that you can defend yourself closer to home. That's the strategy in geopolitics. The Jews are petitioning to, be friendly with the Ptolemies in order to be friendly with the Romans, and they're severally going to the Romans in order to defend themselves against the Greeks so that Antiochus can't come back. That's basically the story here. And this year, right here, 188, is 124 BC. Hyrcanus is solidly in power, and he's going to stay in power for the next 20 years. Okay, we're back at the Magnificat, and I'm going to review this now from the standpoint of the history that she's covering. It's pretty straightforward. I don't think that what I'm going to tell you is like the main thing she's doing, but it is a characteristic of time poems that she would have to do, and I'm not 100% sure what I'm saying is exactly what she meant to do, but we'll call it a hypothesis, okay? She's starting her poem. One of the things a time poem has to do is cover history and then parallel it with the future. That's what Moses did, that's what Isaiah did, that's what Daniel did, and we're going to be getting more into Daniel in this episode. And so that's what we have to see if Mary's doing. Otherwise, there's a mistake that I'm making, or there's something else she's doing. That's the basic idea. So if we take the first hypothesis and say, okay, well, he's born, the Lord is going to be born on Hanukkah. And that was promised ever since Haggai 2. She should be doing a review of history from that point to her current day, and then forward from her current day. That's the style that everybody else follows, so that's what we should expect here. So, we saw how Paul did that. If you've been seeing the 11 GGS videos on Paul, right now those videos are on pause at Diocletian. Paul having gone through the past, starting with Augustus when Christ was born, and then going forward in time all the way to, which you haven't seen yet, but all the way to the rise of Odovaker. That's what his meter does. I've extensively documented it in the Ephesians 1 reparsed doc, but I haven't yet done videos showing it. I've only gotten as far as Diocletian. And now we're interrupting with Mary because I'm now finding out that this is how Paul derived his meter. It's from the Magnificat, which is a big surprise for me. Okay? I don't know, maybe I'm something of a misogynist. I just don't expect a woman to have, that much of a play in the Bible. So this is a really big surprise. But it shouldn't be a surprise because it was her job to train the humanity of Christ. So she would have to be really good on doctrine in order to get that role. And, of course, the Holy Spirit causes it. It's not like she is meritorious of herself. But anyway, this is the chronology that she should be following. This right here corresponds to, I think it is 1 Maccabees 10. Not that Maccabees is a Bible book, but this is where the date is located, which they called in their own calendar 160, which is approximately 152 BC. Okay? That's 12 years after Hanukkah. All right? So she's starting just a straightforward chronology, 12 years after Hanukkah, and then this is 8 years later, which corresponds, I want to say that it's 1 Maccabees 14, the year 167, which is when Demetrius became king. He was sort of like a buffer king that Ptolemy and fought with. And that was a major change in history for the Jews, that whole battling with Demetrius. So it's appropriate that she benchmark it here. This is 12 years after Hanukkah. This is 20 years after Hanukkah, therefore. This, in the Maccabees book, is designated year 171, and this is when John Hyrcanus started to come to power. Now, you have to understand a couple of things that make this kind of important. It was when the Maccabees rose that the royal houses of David, and the high priestly house of Aaron were set aside by the Jews. In other words, they were fighting with a Greek, with Antiochus. And in order to defeat him, most of them had given in or just accepted the problem. So the Maccabee means hammer. Okay, so a guy named Mattathias, who was from the first priestly course, this is something that the Cambridge scholars forget to analyze. They claim they don't know where Mattathias came from. Well, the Bible tells you, and so does the Book of Maccabees. He's from the first priestly course. That tells you his family line. Sometimes scholars just drop the ball. Okay? That means that he was not of the house of Aaron. Some of his relatives might have been. But he himself was not entitled to be a high priest. And he didn't try to be a high priest. He just wanted to be, patriotic and fight for Israel. So he and his sons got together, and, then people gathered around him. And that's how, they were able to drive out Antiochus, and how Hanukkah came about. Well, like anything else, when you have a victory, then people rally around you, and you get all big-headed. So Mattathias, his son was Judas, and he was a good guy, basically. But Judas's brother, Simon, got all full of himself and made himself high priest and tried to found a dynasty on himself. And his son, Hyrcanus, comes to power in what they call 171, and that's at the end of the first Maccabees. All right, he comes to power, and that's approximately 134 BC. Okay, there's going to be a year or two variance here because you have to adjust for beginning and ending of the year. Hanukkah occurs at the end of the year. Okay, so this is about 30 years after Hanukkah occurred, first Hanukkah. And then that brings us down to this next bit, which is about 129 BC. And that was when there was a major victory against the Seleucids, and that kind of won Israel a lot of independence. All right, so that was 5 years later. This is still under Hyrcanus. All right. And this is about 122 BC, and again, there were further victories that basically ensured Israel had her autonomy back. I'm going to have to go get my calendar here, because I mapped all this out. Okay, so that was about 122 BC right there, which you see highlighted, unfortunately, in black on the screen. And then after that, at the 47 mark, which is evocative of Daniel, which we're going to have to get into, at the 47 mark, that's about 117 BC. All right. And there's nothing remarkable that I could find about that particular time. And then it just kind of keeps going on. This is like 100 BC. Am I saying that right? That's 100 right here. So is it there? No, 109 right here. This is 100. And she's marking it. When these things are orange like that, she's saying that those dates are significant. And I don't know why they're significant. That's one of the problems I've been having with her meter, is that either I'm doing it wrong or there's a significance in her meter that I don't know about. And then you come down here to 75, and that's 89 BC, 88, 89. Depends on whether you're calling it beginning or ending of year. All right, 83 is about 81, 80 BC. This 90 is standing for about 73, 74 BC. And here you got something semi-tying to it that I could find anyway, but maybe it's not. At 98 is a significant doctrinal number, even as 63 is, 42, and 35. So she's benchmarking this particular period here with a 98. The doctrinal meaning of the time is signified by the way she's marking it. In other words, this is God votes, and man germinates, this is vote short. In other words, Israel's vote is short at that time. That's how she's characterizing the time. So here at 98, that is kind of like, that's a millennial number. When her son begins his 98th year, that's when the millennium is going to happen, and that was long known ever since David. So it's a pretty significant number, and the time period to which it ties is 65, 64 BC. Well, we all know that Pompey came in and took over, so that the whole line of the whole dynasty of Hyrcanus came to an end in about 65, 64, 63 BC. All right? So she's marking that with a 98, which is kind of important because, like I said, the Maccabees usurped both houses of Aaron and David at this point. So, she's her whole series of rights and that of her cousin Elizabeth are dispossessed at this point. They're reinstated here, except that Herod comes into power as a result of, machinations with Pompey. It's through his dad at this point. It was Herod himself was just a kid, or he was not even born yet. And no, he was a kid because he was born much earlier. So, when Pompey comes in, Rome basically takes over the suzerainty of the region. And so she's giving that a 98 doctrinal value, which I find very interesting. And it's also, 98 years from Hanukkah. I mean, this is a straight chronology. 12 years from Hanukkah, 20 years from Hanukkah, 30 years from Hanukkah, 35 years from Hanukkah. Okay? So that's the straight chronology. So 98 years from Hanukkah, 98 having the significance of millennium, all right? That was basically when, Pompey came in. Now understand that we say it's 63 BC because we're dating to a specific event, but you don't just walk into Egypt in a nanosecond and take over. There was a campaign that took over, took a couple of years. So the Jews often dated things by when a thing began. So I'm not too surprised to see her say 65, 64 BC. 65 end, 64 beginning. That's the way she's dating it. This is all as of end of the prior year. All right? The Bible numbering system gets everybody confused. Bible always makes distinction between beginning and ending of the year. So it drops one or adds one. And, our BCAD dating system also drops and adds, one. So we get really confused, trying to match up the numbers, okay? So she's equating Pompey, Rome's coming in, as a kind of millennial thing, which it really was. It ended up being, okay? And that's when the Herods got into power, because they played games with the different factions that were playing around in Rome. Bet on the losing side, actually. Herod had done that. And then when Octavian won over Antony at the Battle of Actium, which is sort of the outflow of Pompey, okay? That's how Herod the Great came into power. Okay, I mean, he came into power through Antony, and then when Octavian beat Antony, he made nice with Octavian, who was then known as Augustus. And that's how Herod got into power. Well, one of the big things that Herod did was to rebuild the temple. The temple was in extreme disrepair. And on top of that, he wanted to ingratiate himself with the people, and he wanted to, he's kind of like a prototype of Revelation 11, where he thought so well of himself, he thought he could outdo what God had done in the building of the second temple. So, I mean, it's a combination of a sort of Antichrist concept of Revelation 11 and a concept of how do you want to call it, really, doing to the temple what should have been done by the priests. You got to understand the priesthood was completely corrupted. That's what I'm covering in the Synoptics videos, is that at the time Christ comes, the priesthood was entirely corrupted. And part of that corruption started back here with the Maccabees. Okay? They usurped both houses. Everything about the Maccabean period is apostate. It's horrible. We shouldn't be praising it. And I myself am embarrassed about that, because that was one of the ways that I got into the Bible, was that I heard the story about the Maccabees when I was a kid. And I got all, excited about the menorah and everything like that. Yeah, well, I was wrong. They're horrible people. Just plain awful. There's nothing good about the Maccabees. At all. Zero. They were like what became the Catholics did under Constantine. They were jerks. They were horrible. There's everything bad to say about them. Okay? And so I can understand why Mary would equate Pompey's coming in. Because the Romans were pretty hands-off when it came to religion. All right? I can understand why Mary equates that with the 98 when Pompey came in. But, you had the problem with the Herods, and the priesthood was still corrupt, but it was more free as a result of Pompey coming in than it had been under the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans were disgusting, awful people. They hated the Word of God in every way, shape, and form there was to hate it. They were trying to replace the Bible. There's nothing good to say about those people at all. Zero. Okay? And it started with Simon, and it got really bad under Hyrcanus. And of course, Hyrcanus made nice with the Romans, and that caused his own undoing. So then when she gets here, this was Pompey. Okay, roughly. And then this is about 59, 58 AD. BC, rather. Okay? Now that's the end of the first paragraph for her. Okay, this is all one unit syntactically at this point. What's bothering me about this, except I understand why she's doing it, is that this is not the right place for a seventh paragraph to occur. It's, hotepeblepsin. Okay, you could, if you stop the sentence, you're supposed to stop the sentence when this happens. When you see it divisible by 7, the sentence should be coming to an end at the end of the last syllable in that phrase. Okay, well, yeah, that's a famous phrase in Judaism. I can sort of go with that. Because God sees. God sees, in Hebrew and even in English, if you just say something like God sees, you don't need to say anything after that. Because it's got omnidirectional meaning. You don't want to put an object there to convey the omnidirectional meaning. So I can understand why she's putting 35 there. And that's either the 35th year of Herod or she's 35. That's her dateline. That doesn't disrupt this chronology that's also going on. So I understand this part. But this too is a dateline, and 42 sevens means 294 years before she speaks. I haven't yet been able to find out what she's talking about there. But this, you wouldn't say, well, you could, I guess. For he has regarded the humiliation, and that stops there. That could be a generic statement applying to all times and all objects, because no objects are really mentioned. I mean, when you say the humiliation, that's the ostensible direct object, all right? But the humiliation of whom? It needs a phrase. Okay, but if you're stating it as a generic, and this is a facility that we even have in English, for he regarded the humiliation, the mind will fill in the blanks. Anybody's humiliation is in view. It's a generic pan, time statement. So I can understand why she's dividing it here and here. But this would have to then begin a new paragraph that gets divisible by 7, and that doesn't make sense. I mean, there's this facility in Greek and even in Hebrew, and we used to use it in 19th century English when we're saying concerning. You'd say of the slave. And you've seen that kind of stuff in 19th century books. They will have of as the first letter, meaning concerning. And then they have the title, what the book is about, what the section is about, what the poem is about. Okay, and the same facility existed in Greek and in Hebrew. But it's kind of awkward. So then this would become the title of a new paragraph that ends here at 63. Okay, and 63 ends in her chronology at about 110, 109 BC. Hyrcanus is in his last years. All right, why is she doing that? Why is this there? How does that text relate to Hyrcanus? I can see the text relating to history this far. That makes sense. Okay, considering the backdrop is Hanukkah and how Israel gets free. This all makes sense. But I don't understand, because this is Hyrcanus' time, I don't understand why she'd be linking that to that text there. So that's something I got to solve. Okay. So we last stopped with the chronology right here. Okay, where she's doing again a doubling of paragraphs. We said this was Pompey. Okay, that corresponds to 65, 64, 63 BC. And then this is 7 years after that, which is, 59, 58 BC roughly. Okay, I don't know why that's of particular import. Okay, she's benchmarking the whole thing to that period. In other words, this is all from Hanukkah down to current time and past. In the straight chronology, she's basically making that paragraph start at Hanukkah and end at 59, 58 BC. I don't know why. Okay. Then we have a new paragraph. This one is easier to parse, easier to understand. The text is more generic, and it's easier to understand what she's doing. Okay, this, forget the left-hand side with Luke. I haven't worked out why he's doing that yet. This 115 corresponds to about 48 BC. Okay, and historically that makes sense. Okay, then this is corresponding to about 49, 48 BC. You have to add end of year. This is end of year 40 or beginning of year 39 BC. Okay, this is 30 BC. Okay, then this is 2120 BC. All right, I'm going to get to the really important point in a minute. This is about 1817 BC, and it's this one that I want to focus on. This is the 160th, the year, the 160th year from Hanukkah. At the end of that year is Hanukkah. In other words, your 160th year would have begun on your 159th birthday, and it lasts until you actually reach your 160th birthday, at which point your 161st year begins. Okay, this would therefore be the year containing the 160th anniversary of the temple. It corresponds to late 4, early 3 BC when Christ is born. And look at the text. Those hungry he fills with good things. Now remember when Christ is going to say later at the Sermon on the Mount, when you hunger or thirst for righteousness. That's what, she's quoting this from the Old Testament. There are a lot of refrains about this in the Old Testament. She's quoting this from the Old Testament. And he's the one to fill us with righteousness. See how apt this is? This is the year he's born is going to be the 160th anniversary on the 160th anniversary of original Hanukkah. And that equates to our late 4 or early 3 BC. Okay? Now, that's why I'm really curious, because in our BC AD terms, we would be calling Hanukkah 164. So why is Luke doing that? I don't know yet. It's just a little too cute for words at this point. Okay, so from this point on, she's talking about when Christ is born. She's talking about 9 months future to the moment she's talking. So everything from this point forward is future. You got that? Future with respect to her. Now this is just really kind of odd how this works out. Okay. So this ends up being Christ. That we're going to switch now to his age, because that makes it, that's close to, that's what Anno Domini accounting is based on. So this is when he's 11, end of his year 11, beginning his year 12. Well, we know that Luke's going to later be telling that story. Okay? And he was sent off. They went off without him, and he's in the temple when they find him. I don't know if this is deliberate. I'm just noting a coincidence, okay? So, end of age 11, beginning of age 12. At age 12, you were considered a man, as far as being able to comment on Scripture in Jewish culture. All right? Then look at this one. All right, so that's age 11. All right, this is age 20, 11 and 12 is 23. And at age 20, you were eligible for military service, and you were eligible to marry. Okay? So that's the 183rd anniversary of the temple. Okay, so remember, this was age 23. 5 years later, age 28. All right? Now, bear in mind, she's talking from the standpoint of the schedule. You know, with hindsight, we know that he died at 33, but he was supposed to die at 40. Okay, so he's age 28 here. All right? 28 and 10 is 38, and then 3 more is 41. He was scheduled to die at age 40 in his 41st year. He was born on Hanukkah. He would have been 40 years and 3 months old at the scheduled death that he was supposed to die at Passover. Okay, 3 months later. So she's timing this, and that would have been the beginning of the 201st year of the temple. He would have been in his 41st year. You are at your new year on the anniversary of your birthday, because your birthday is an end of year for you, for your life. You're ending a year and you're beginning a new year all on the same day. That's just like how in Israel's time, you know, the day begins at sundown on the prior day. So she's mapping this to his scheduled death. His scheduled death. And then, just like promised to Abraham, and this whole section here ends up taking you to 54, what we will, you know, his age 54. Abraham had matured in 2046, which was 54 years early, 54 years prior to the deadline of 2100 from Adam's fall. She is balancing to the time credit owed the Gentiles from Abraham maturing too early. So that's one reason why Christ had to die, or was scheduled to die, at age 40, so that enough time would be left over to pay back the time credit to the Gentiles. See, when Daniel 9 is written, this whole time credit thing was very well known, and we're going to see that when I go to Daniel in a minute. This whole time credit thing was very well known, that there was a time owed the Gentiles. It was not Israel's time. So it's not listed in Daniel 9. There is a gap that everybody knew and celebrated as Jubilee and Pentecost. And then there was an extra 4 years in there, which was part of Passion Week. Passion Week depicted the tribulation, the first half, the second half. Okay? So she's taking all that into account, which of course she's known ever since you grew up. You know? So she's adding 14, get this, 14 years to his age 40. Because this takes you to 54 when you do the math. Okay, this would be 40, and then this takes you to, well, 41, okay? And this takes you to 54 if you add up all the math from here forward. You get to his age 54 in the 217th anniversary of Hanukkah.